My name is Russell C. Baker. I'm the course director and also the designer of this research project into how people can appropriate Lonergan's methodology without necessarily studying or knowing very much about his actual work. This course is designed as part of an emergent cosmopolis group. The group that currently is active in creating this group has been in existence for over 12 years. We meet about once every week for about 2.5 hours, and we gradually go through a series of process that has started with the schematic, which lays out the general language that we use, to the handbook, which lays out the basic approach that we're taking, to a mission statement that places the emergent cosmopolis group within the common sense world of people in general, the theoretical world of university, and the transcendental realm of some divine mystery. This is an ongoing project. We're very far from completion. In fact, it probably never will be completed. But this particular research project is part of introducing people to a stream that would eventually have them become masters or experts, or at least proficient in doing the type of cosmopolis work that Lonergan lays out in Insight. And just in case you're not familiar, cosmopolis is Lonergan's notion of how to combat the common sense bias towards expedient action without taking into account any theological, philosophical, or even long-term consequences of what this local action may do. This particular research project has been divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 you've already had a look at. We've gone through the series of 7 days, which lays out the basic analytical tools that you will need to do if you want to move into Phase 2 and then eventually take control of it yourself in Phase 3. These tools are laid out in a booklet that's attached to a PDF file that you will be able to access. This covers the basic notes for all 7 days and gives you a basic idea of what is what and where things are. You can use it as a reference manual. By the time we end up with the end of the case study, which is Phase 2, you should be fairly familiar with how not only the tools themselves, but how they can be applied to the situation in which you're in. Just to let you know, the Phase 1 is about the equivalent of being introduced, being brought up onto the stage of an orchestra pit. And you have all the instruments around, but none of the players. And someone is a guide, goes through and says, this is the trombone, this is what it sounds like, this is its range, this is what it does within the orchestral unit. Over here you have the violins, the violas, the cellos, and the bass fiddles. They provide the string context of an orchestrational piece. And over there you have the brass, and this is what it sounds like. And you have the chimes and perhaps some other percussion instruments too as well. In Phase 1, it was simply pointing it out. That was all that was required. Just pay attention, be sensitive to the terms such as emergent probability, the realm of interiority, the notion of development, and so forth. Now is the time in Phase 2 to start picking up an instrument or a couple of instruments and starting to learn how to play the music. Now this is something that is not going to be accomplished overnight. Like any learning, any new discipline, it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a slow accumulation of insights over a period of time until eventually everything comes together and you say, aha, that's it, now I know. So at your beginner stage, don't be upset about the confusion, the unknowns, how things fit together. All this will come with time. What is important is to stay with the process, stay with it on a day-to-day basis, incorporate it into your living as you go out through the rest of the day, not in a deliberate, but just in a reflective fashion. Because this whole process, Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3, is really an exercise in reflection rather than in intellectual work per se. And it's reflection in the sense of what is really of value, how it works, and the core thing of who you are as a person, as a being living on Earth at this particular time in your own particular place. So it is not easy to learn to play an instrument, and it will not be easy to learn to appropriate Lonergan's tools, even though at this stage we're simply considering it a thought experiment. It's a question of, well, suppose Lonergan's methodology is actually, works, is good, is fruitful. We're going to suggest that it does from our own experience. And all we ask of you is simply to say, okay, what is it that you can anticipate? What is it that you can learn if you apply these set of analytical tools that we're providing for you? That's all. We don't ask you to accept it. Acceptance of this sort of thing takes a longer time than the length of this entire little research project through all its 3 phases. But we do ask you to have an open mind, and we do ask you to be patient in the sense of you will no doubt come across people with ideas, with orientations that are quite different from your own, and in fact you may be antagonistic towards them. And this is again part of the learning process, because what we're trying to do is to introduce you to a way of thinking, a way of approaching how you understand things, and not the way in which you actually come to understand it. Now, this may be a bit of a difficult thing to point out. What I'm saying is that it is more important when you meet somebody else, and a lot of this is personal encounter in what we call mutual self-mediation. What is important is that you recognize the values that are inherent in another person. And then you may reject them, you may accept them, but just the meeting this other person challenges you to reflect on the deeper meanings of who you are, who you trust, who you give your allegiance to. Those are probably the 2 key things. It's just to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this entire research project. As we go through this, you'll find that it will be very confusing, that patience is required, and also that you would be able to listen, not to what is happening in your own head, but to what somebody else is saying. We have a very tendency in our intellectually orientated rather than reflective society to prepare our answers before the other person has stopped speaking. In fact, we may have our answer prepared in our head within a moment or two after the other person opens their mouth and starts giving their opinion. It is very hard to learn just to sit and listen without preparing your response in advance. And in this case, what you're listening to is partly to what is being given to you by somebody else, but you're also listening to your own reaction to the words to somebody else, because it's this deepening awareness of your reaction or your orientation that comes out that you really need to appropriate, to objectify, to make real. Because until you objectify that realm of interiority that you use, that is the area in which you make your judgments. You decide what you're going to do. You make your judgments of value, for example. Until you have an awareness of these as an ongoing operation. You see, the thing is, we do all these operations so quickly and so fast that we're not really aware of what it is that we're actually doing. But normally this is not a problem. For human beings in a situation, you need to be able to respond quickly to different situations. You need to be able to process information very quickly without blocking everything down in kind of a methodical, intellectual fashion. But the problem is that when this process breaks down, when you start entering into a society that's more and more fragmented, more and more power exercising, more and more that nobody can actually seem to be able to do anything because any effort by one group is countered by another group, and even together the situation becomes so complex that what you attempted to do often has unexpected consequences. So predictability is certainly part of it. In many ways, what we're trying to do is we're trying to appropriate the past as we can learn through the news, and then find our own foundational stance to move into the future. Now, in this particular project, we're picking, there's kind of two things that we're doing. It's like a scissors when you cut something. In this case, we have an upper blade, which is our analytical tools. These are the tools that allow us to understand, or to pick out what is appropriate, to anticipate what there is to be known, to work on understanding the situation in a proper way. And as we pointed out in phase one, intellectual conversion involves a shift from naive realism or empiricism or conceptualism and into Lonergan's methodological approach of critical realism. Now, we don't expect you to understand these terms, certainly not at this stage. You gradually find what they mean to you, not through an intellectual effort of sitting down and mastering them, but through the effort of simply bringing these elements to your awareness when you're doing things. For example, Lonergan's personal method for understanding, which is the transcendental method, deals with experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding. Now, in a sense, each of these levels is a different way of existing in the world. When you're experiencing something, you simply want to be open to experience. You're not passive because you're anticipating already what it is that you're going to experience. But you want to let the experiences around you kind of flood you and just open up without trying to intellectualize anything. So it's just being open to experience. In some cases it may be very difficult. There are traumatic situations, there are some horrifying periods in human history that you really might not want to be aware of, but still the openness to experience is a very important component. But that's not where we end. In what we experience, we start to ask questions. And this question shifts us into an intellectual detective mode. And this is where we're really very familiar with this in a technological society. Because most of the time we have a question, we go out, we search for the answer, we find the answer, and we're like a detective. We're looking for the clues. We're looking for how things fit together. And eventually you get an insight and you say, now I know. It was a butler who did it. The favorite excuse of all murder mysteries. But the detective aspect of it, you'll note, is already focused on a particular question. It is not open to everything. It's already starting to narrow things down. The other thing too as well that conceptualists and ideologists and so forth miss is the notion of judgment. Because once you have an insight into something, you may have an insight, it may be a good insight, but it could equally well be a bad insight. You can have an oversight, just a misunderstanding. You think you know, but when you start to compare it with reality, you find out that it's not really true. So once you have the insight, you shift into a different mode of being, which is the one that we're moving towards, and this is a dispassionate judge. Now, a dispassionate judge has their kind of legal background in their legal training, which in our sense is the analytical tools that we're appropriating from Lonergan's work. But the thing is that the judge has to collect the evidence, has to decide what evidence to collect, first of all, collect the relevant evidence, weigh it carefully to understand what this evidence means in terms of whether the insight is true or not, and then finally make a judgment. If the judge is not an egotistical person or doesn't belong to a particular group that he or she is going to support no matter what, then if they're reasonable, okay, then your judgment is probably virtually unconditioned. Unless, of course, there are other conditions, the questions that come up later on that may question it. It's virtually unconditioned because as humans, we never achieve that ultimate sense of truth that we can only put in the universal perspective of the divine mystery. So our understanding is always proportionate to the fact that we are human, with our particular senses, our particular interests, backgrounds, and all the other things that go with it. But that's not all. After you've decided what is true, there's a question of what do you do? Because in a sense, we're not just sensile creatures that sit on the bottom of the ocean waiting for food to come by. We move around in the world. We interact with others. We move furniture. We make things. We create things, from machinery to complex organizations. In fact, our greatest creation is this symbolic world mediated by meaning, which was one of the analytical tools that we presented very early on in Phase 1. Now, the way in which we shift into this level of deciding what to do depends on what it is that we value. Now, we've already covered another analytical tool, which is Lonergan's invariant structure of the human good. But there's another question of what is it that you really value? Because the human good we can break down, as Lonergan does, into concrete goods like a cup with some coffee in it, or we can break it down into the state of the order of a society. You know, places like Somalia right now, or even Syria, are largely failed states. You can't really do it. Can you have a PhD program going in Syria right now? I'm afraid not. Your options are very limited in what you can and can't do. So the order, the societal order, the spirit of living in Syria is rather low as compared to, let's say, what it's like to live in North America, or to some extent in China or Japan or any of the other really industrial, developed kind of nations that we consider developed sort of nations. It is what we value that is really the core element behind this research project. Because there are three things that you can value that make a shift, as Lonergan says. He calls it conversion, but it's a very difficult term for most people to understand because it doesn't really apply to religious conversion per se. There's three types of conversion shifts in who that person is that occurs at the level of deciding of what is really, of making judgments of value. The first is really has to do with the divine mystery as the most powerful of them all. And that is simply, as Lonergan puts it, a falling in love with the divine mystery, a falling in love with God. Now this is a fundamental change, because once you fall in love with this divine mystery, your world changes quite completely, and it brings in an element to human living that now has to take into account the reality of a divine mystery operative in human affairs. So now you can no longer be the sole dictator or sole manipulator of others. It's all done within this context of cooperating with this divine mystery in whatever the situation is at hand. Now, this is something everybody has to work out for themselves. Conversion like this does not take place at a mass level. It always starts within the individual. And this is something that we will explore later as we go into the case study. The second form of conversion is, you could call it, I suppose, bravery. It's not the idea that you can put your satisfactions aside in order to pursue something of fundamental value to you, let's say like truth or honesty or justice. It's more of a question of whether you can actually, are you free enough to be able to do that? So it's a question of freedom and of liberty, that you can actually put aside your personal satisfactions in order to pursue something that is greater than your own personal self-interest. And this is something you can see in a lot of people, and some people we do it to a varying degree. It's only with the divine mystery that we can do it consistently over a long period of time. But it is inbuilt into us to want to do good. Unfortunately, as human beings, sometimes we mix up the good with the bad, and we decide to do the good, and the good turns out to be the bad, and it gets into a bit of a mess. The third level of conversion that Lonergan talks about is the intellectual level. And this is really very, very key to what we're doing in this research project. Because it is a shift away from a common sense understanding that reality is something out there to be seen, and that if the person doesn't see it, then they're crazy, they're idiotic, and so forth. You can see that a lot in people who have a very utopian vision of what's going on. And they're so sure of their reality that they can't comprehend that somebody else could take the same material in this complex world and come to a different conclusion. Because literally, as a naive realist, they see what it is that they believe, without actually putting any judgment call on whether or not what they see is correct or not. They have no way of saying to their perceptions that maybe what I perceive is not really what's going on, that you need that deeper aspect of it. Now, Lonergan provides this through his transcendental method at the individual level, which we've been going through in terms of experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding. But he also provides the methodological tools for community as a whole to engage in the same process as a community rather than as an individual. Because part of the problem these days is that the reality is too complex now for any one mind to understand. The only way that we can get a reasonably accurate understanding, a reasonably accurate judgment of value to decide what to do is through a collaborative effort. And the advantage in following Lonergan's methodologies, both the transcendental method and the functional specialties, is that the functional specialties allows the individual to be able to participate in something greater than themselves, knowing that their participation has a place within it. It's like a scientific endeavor. You can be a beginner, you can be a very advanced student, but you can always, no matter what level that you are, add something to what is known, the theory, the experimental aspect of it, so you can always be a part of something greater than yourself. So this is something that will come out as we go into phase 2, and hopefully will become a living reality in your own life as you enter into the phase 3, which is where you take control of the research project itself and you come to your own conclusions. Because by now, hopefully, you will have mastered enough of the analytical tools to use them on your own, both as an individual and as part of a group working together. And the resources we have is really two. One is what I've already mentioned, the booklet that comes out of the notes. So if you ever need to refer to an aspect, you have this as kind of a referral tool. But our main text is this one. And this is Lonergan's Method in Theology. There's a recent formal version kind of that's just come out, but it doesn't differ in any significant way from this 1971 version. This is our resource text. This is when you're starting to learn the tools, both the transcendental method and the functional specialties, research, interpretation, history, dialectics, foundations, doctrine, systematics, and communications. Whatever you're interested in, this is where you find your instrument. This is where you can learn the techniques in playing that instrument. So if you're interested in the foundational stance of people, the orientation, which is my own particular area of interest, then you will find in this book the basic indicators of what it means to do that type of work, what information you need. In my case, I need dialectics. I need those fundamental conflicts in society. And also where it provides information for the next group, which for me is the area of doctrines, not in the religious sense of doctrines, but doctrines in the sense of fundamental beliefs connected with reality. So this is where you learn to play. This is like a musical guide to your instrument and your instruments. So this is the introduction. We're moving into the case study now, and this is day 1. I'm going into the material. What we're doing in day 1 is two things. One is emphasizing the focus on fundamental institutional change, particularly at the global level, because these changes will work themselves down. Now, it's true that the lower level, the regional and the local levels will have an influence on the global level, but the major changes that are going on are largely at the global level. And these are changes that we need to know, because when we're going into understanding anything that's going on, you need to understand it in terms of the orientation of the different participants, the way in which they structure reality, their own value choices as to what they treasure above everything else, the plans and policies that they tend to make, the scope for action, and a whole variety of other things that we covered in the analytical section. The way in which you're going to do this is through the news. The news is an outlet for all these global institutions, local and regional, but influenced very largely by the fundamental institutional changes taking place, to persuade others to their point of view. Now, this persuasion is really an effort to gain resources or to avoid the loss of something that they value. So you can think of the global network as a combination of institutions and individuals who lead these institutions, engaging in a whole series of cooperative and competitive and sometimes downright destructive activities, all of which become reflected in what they want the reporters or the news to present or to get out to the people at large. Because they know that they have to have, in many cases, public support to do what they want to do. So the case study involves news. News is our data. We have our analytical structure to make sense of it, our higher blade operator, the transcendental method and functional specialties. But we also have the actual news, which gives us clues as to who the major players are, what are the major media influences going on, what are such interesting things like astroturfing, which is becoming something that the web, the latest web development and so forth, things like Google and Facebook and so forth are now engaged in, or allow others to engage in, I should put it that way. Now, in the case study, understanding these factors is not as important as learning how to play your instrument. So you're going to be in the second phase. What we're going to be doing is, pretty simple tunes, shall we say, just to get you used to how the instrument works, how people work together, and within this type of framework and so forth. It is only in phase 3 that once people have really mastered to the extent that they can start to appropriate and use the methodologies themselves, that the shift really finally takes place away from the process to what the process reveals in terms of content. And in phase 3, that's where we really start to understand what the fundamental institutional changes are, how they impact regional and local entities, how the conflict and competition between these different institutions plays themselves out in the news, and how you can use the news to understand the dynamics of what's going on behind the scenes. So all this is up to come. Today is simply day 1. In the attached notes is my introduction to two things: the notion of fundamental institutional change, but also the beginnings of understanding what there is to be understood through the worldview of emergent probability. And the first step of that is to identify the primary level of intelligibility, the conditioning level below it, and the sublating level above. And in the notes, we're going to go into identifying the primary level of intelligibility is the global level of institutional interactions. This is going to be a primary level. Conditioning that is the conditions of the society, let's say the industrialized society in particular, because that allows for a global institutional structure to emerge, is the way in which the broader civilization, technological innovations, also social and political innovations too as well, condition the emergence of what is possible at the global level. Now, the other level that we're going to is higher than the global level of politics. And you may ask, well, what is higher than that? And our answer is the transcendental realm of meaning. And we're going to take as a real operating factor in human history the distinct possibility, likelihood, almost inevitability of a divine mystery operating in human affairs. Now, this divine mystery we're going to put at this transcendental level of being. It sublates, again, another term that comes out in our analytical tool, it sublates what is and what, it sublates kind of what operations are encouraged and what connections are encouraged and what are encouraged at the global level. So the global level actors may think that they're actually the prime movers and doers, but what they do is conditioned by or sublated by this transcendental reality which is embedded in the individual. And this is a dynamic that we'll go into when you go into the notes. So the notes is my initial attempt to do it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is a work in progress. We don't claim to have the ultimate conclusions at the beginning. This is a searching process. And in fact, being aware of the searching process as it plays out in you is one of the prime functions of this research project in the first place. Now, as we go through, what we understand will become better, it will become improved, and it may eventually lead to the point, this is something that should be shared with other people, that it's reliable, it's a good study, it's worthy of going into the public research world. But that's a long way down the line. We start out kind of at the bottom, where we are, with the questions that we have, and then gradually, incrementally, we build and we build and we build, sometimes slipping back, sometimes taking little detours, but we keep building until we reach a threshold point which is not perfection, but is simply something that's acceptable to the research community or to those who are really interested in understanding, I suppose you would call it public policy, particularly at the global level. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you've gone through all of the videos at Phase 1, kudos for you. We didn't post the last one or two because part of this process gets very personal. This is where it opens up to your own orientation, and giving personal things out to the community at large is not really something that we want to do. But nevertheless, as part of a community, as part of kind of an ongoing little group that's endeavoring to do this, this is where it kind of leads to. It's these personal relationships concerned by people who are relatively free and are really focused on what is really and truly of value in what it is that we do or that we don't do. So, welcome to day 1 of Phase 2. And thank you for listening.